Bible study this week, we discussed this word diaspora. Growing up, I most associated diaspora with the Jewish people after the fall of the temple in 70 CE and the expulsion of Jews from Jerusalem and much of the Holy Land in 132 CE. Over the years, I have come to understand that while this was part of the diaspora story, the diaspora began with the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel in around 722 BCE, and even more so with the Babylonian conquest of the southern kingdom of Judah around 586 BCE. These earlier events of the diaspora meant that when early Christian missionaries, including Paul and Thomas, set out throughout the Mediterranean, down the east coast of Africa, and along the Silk Road, they were able to go first to synagogues. There were already Jewish communities throughout these trading routes because the ancestors of these communities had been forced out of their homeland centuries before by conquering armies. Through these events, the Jewish people created an identity that was qualitatively different from their neighbors. While nomadic peoples are generally perceived by outsiders as being disconnected from their lands, in many cases, they have a profound connection to the land and to the changing of the seasons when compared to their sedentary neighbors. They follow the wildlife as they migrate and search out fruits and vegetables when they are in season. But in the case of Judaism, an identity developed around ritual, genealogy, and worship that separated the Jewish people from their neighbors. Every year, even today, the end of the Passover festival, the prayers conclude with "next year in Jerusalem." But most people living in the diaspora, even in the time of Jesus, had no intention or interest in returning to the Holy Land to live. They had new lives in new lands. They were still Jewish. They still worshiped the one God, and they still kept kosher. But home was no longer a physical place in the Holy Land. Now, for those of us living in the United States, for many of our neighbors in Canada, and for the non-native peoples of Australia and New Zealand, the profound nature of this change is hard to understand. For those who are African American, slavery has obliterated anything beyond DNA evidence of areas in Africa in which ancestors may have originally come from. For white people living in these lands, we identify with specific countries and lands in Europe. But the vast majority of us are generations removed from those places. Many of us have lost the names of villages and regions from which our ancestors came. Many of us are lucky if we can identify the ships that carried our ancestors to the shores of the lands we now call home. For those of us of Irish extraction, this is particularly so. While my grandmother's family did not emigrate until the 1920s, and there are still specific buildings that we can point to as being home to our ancestors, my grandfather's family came to the United States in the 1840s. And while there are some ship manifests, they only tell of where the family, already broken by famine, departed from, not their home villages or counties. And this is the story of most people who identify with Irish heritage today. There are 10 to 15 times as many people in the world today who claim to be part of the Irish diaspora compared to people living in Ireland. And while Ireland, or at least the southern counties, have been free and independent for over a century, and even in the north there have been peace and resurgence for decades, most of us look at Ireland as a place to visit. But our lives, our homes, are in these other lands. All of this is to say that when we talk about diaspora, whether it is that of the Irish or that of Judaism, it changes the notion of land. We carry our lands with us, in our hearts and in our souls. This weekend, as we saw yesterday and again today, many people who have never set foot on Irish soil will once again recall a shared heritage and identity of the distinctly Irish Christianity that the Roman Welsh St. Padraig brought our ancestors. Even as many of us have left the Roman Catholic Church, this identity with Irish Christianity, the dignity of work, a solidarity with the poor, and a sense that the veil between this world and the next can be porous, it means a strong and distinct part of this identity. And is this sense of diasporic living, this identity with a land we have never seen, but nonetheless carry with us, that Paul speaks of in our second reading. When we claim the one God as our own, we are taking on an identity as a people who are living in a land that is not our own. We are the people of heaven living on earth. And like the Jewish and Irish diasporic communities, we are called upon to hold in our hearts our homelands, even as we remain generations removed from, putting our toes in the soil. We are called upon to bring to this land, to this earth, in our actions, in our love, the land that is our true home, heaven. Amen.